Hello and welcome to today's video. My name is Kobe. Today we're going to be talking about some basic air rifle safety training. This video is being made specifically for the Mid-Pacific Air Riflery team. However, a lot of this information can be used universally with all firearms. This video isn't meant to replace any sort of in-person safety training. I still recommend that anyone who is attending any sort of shooting program attend an actual live in-person safety training so that they can handle the firearms and equipment. Basically, what I want this video to do is to give our first year air rifle shooters an idea of what they can expect prior to their first day of air rifle safety training. The way that I'm going to be doing this video is that first I'm going to start by reading directly from the notes that we give to our first year students, and then afterwards I'm going to do a live demonstration of some of the things that the notes talk about. I hope you find this video to be educational and that you learn something from it. Please enjoy. Learning to handle guns safely. These are steps to be followed in developing the commitment, knowledge, and skills to handle guns safely. Goal. The goal of air riflery safety training is not just to reduce gun-related accidents, it is to eliminate them altogether. This goal is established with the conviction that it is possible to have a perfect safety record in shooting sports activities. MAT. The primary gun parts, the muzzle, action, and trigger, are the keys to learning the rules for safe gun handling. Everyone must know these gun parts, whether they ever do any target shooting or not. MAT Performance Standards. The basic rules for safe gun handling that must be mastered focus on the muzzle, action, and trigger. Practice safety. To be able to handle gun safety in air riflery, we must not only learn the rules and procedures for safe gun handling, but we must also master these rules and procedures by actually handling air rifles during range firing activities. Safety is not mastered unless it is actually practiced. Safe gun handling rules are universal. The rules you will learn in air riflery about gun safety can be applied to other guns or firearms that you may encounter at your home or other situations. Primary gun parts and their functions. The first step in being safe with air rifles or any other gun is to learn the three primary parts of the gun and their functions. These key gun parts are the basis for the safe gun handling rules that everyone who handles, fires, or is in an area where guns are handled must know. Muzzle. This is the forward end of the barrel. This is the point where the pellet or projectile leaves the barrel when the gun is fired. A gun is aimed by pointing its muzzle at the target. When a projectile is fired, it will strike exactly where the muzzle is pointed. Action. The working mechanism of the gun. Gun actions typically have a bolt or cocking lever that is used to open and close the action so that the gun can be loaded and unloaded. Fundamentally, a gun cannot be fired unless its action is closed and locked. Trigger. The trigger is part of the action or working mechanism of the gun. The trigger is a lever that projects out of the bottom of the action. A trigger guard protects the trigger. After a gun is loaded and the action is closed, the gun is fired by pulling or applying pressure to the trigger. Know how rifle actions function. It is vitally important that anyone who shoots or handles an air rifle or any gun know at least the basics of how that gun functions. On the Daisy M853 and other air rifles that are used in air riflery, there is a bolt that can be opened to cock the firing mechanism and closed to prepare the mechanism for firing. We must all learn how to operate this bolt. Except for muzzle loading firearms, all other guns also have an action or firing mechanism that can be opened or closed. For example, the small bore rifles that are used in many junior rifle clubs have a bolt that can be opened to make the rifle safe and closed to prepare it for firing. One of the most important features of all gun actions is that they are essentially unable to fire a shot as long as the bolt or action is open. In target shooting, the open actions become the primary safety that is used to ensure that a rifle cannot be unintentionally fired. Okay, so right now we're going to go over some different parts of the rifle. So the three major parts of a rifle are the stock, barrel, and action. The stock consists of the butt, comb or cheek piece, grip, and forend or forearm. The barrel has a certain size or diameter hole that runs its full length. This is called the bore. The diameter of this hole is usually called the caliber. Inside the bore is rifling, spirals, lands, and grooves that engage the projectile and cause it to spin. The breech is the back end of the barrel where the chamber is located. The muzzle is the front end of the barrel where the projectile exits upon firing. The sights are attached to the barrel to help the shooter aim the rifle accurately. Action. Sometimes this is called the receiver. It includes the bolt or breech block, the firing pin, the trigger guard, and the safety. The safety is a mechanism that, once engaged, is designed to prevent a rifle from firing by locking its trigger into place. It is usually located near the trigger or on the trigger guard. The safety may be located in different places on various models of guns. Some air guns may not have a safety. We must always remember that it is the user's responsibility to know how the safety operates. Safeties, being mechanical devices, can fail. They are not foolproof. Safeties are not normally used, meaning engaged and disengaged, between every shot in air riflery. This is because the primary safety in air riflery and other types of target shooting is keeping the action open. Most importantly, rifles on target ranges are loaded only on the firing line and only when they are to be fired at a target. The user is the only reliable safety when they follow the safety rules. Rule 1. Muzzle control. The first thing that anyone who handles a gun must do whenever they pick up or receive a gun is to control the direction the muzzle is pointing. Gun muzzles must always be pointed in a safe direction. That means never pointing the gun at another person. In most cases, pointing a gun in a safe direction means pointing the gun muzzle upward. On a shooting range, gun muzzles should be pointed upward or downrange towards the targets. When carrying a gun, the safest way to carry the gun is to point the muzzle upward with the muzzle held above the head. Rule 2. Actions open. The second thing everyone who handles a gun must do immediately after they get the muzzle pointed in a safe direction is to visually check the gun's action and be sure it is open. The safety standard is that gun actions must always be kept open except when the gun is on the firing line and dry firing or live firing has been authorized or when guns are in a safe storage. A CBI, also known as a clear barrel indicator, is a brightly colored cord that is inserted into an air rifle's barrel to demonstrate that the action is open and that there is no pellet in the barrel. A gun with an open action cannot be fired. This means that keeping gun actions open whenever they are on a range or other location is the primary means of assuring that they cannot be unintentionally fired. Rule 3. Finger off the trigger. One of the best means of preventing the unintentional firing of shots is to keep the index finger off of the trigger until the gun is actually being aimed at the target. Whenever handling or carrying a gun of any type, it is important to keep all fingers outside of the trigger guard. The trigger guard on air rifles and other guns protects the trigger from being accidentally released. After an air rifle is loaded on the firing line, the index finger should be held outside of the trigger guard while the rifle is lifted and placed into the firing position. Only after beginning to look through the sights and aim should the finger be moved into the trigger guard to contact the trigger. CBI, Clear Barrel Indicator. CBIs are made from bright orange weed whacker cord. They should be cut long enough that when they are inserted into an air rifle barrel, The cord projects out both ends of the breech and muzzle by at least 3 inches. CBIs must be inserted in air rifle barrels whenever they are taken from the storage and onto a firing line. CBIs must remain in air rifles until firing exercise begins and the range officer gives instructions to begin preparation for firing. When preparation for firing begins, the CBI may be removed. When someone completes a firing exercise, they must immediately open the air rifle action, place the rifle on the ground, and insert the CBI. Shooters can use a soft cloth to wipe the CBI each time before it is inserted into the air rifle. This will prevent the CBI from picking up grit and introducing it into the rifle barrel. Safety rules apply to all guns. Students should know that all of the rules in air riflery regarding safe gun handling will also apply to any other firearm, be it a BB gun, air rifle, paintball gun, airsoft gun, or traditional firearm. It is your responsibility to practice what you have just learned to ensure your safety when handling firearms. Alright, so we've just completed the safe gun handling section of our notes, and now we're going to go into the live demonstration. So one of the first things that the notes talks about is why it is so important that everyone, whether they like firearms or not, know how to handle a firearm safely. And something that I like to tell people is this. A firearm, like any other useful tool, like a screwdriver or a bandsaw, a hammer, even a vehicle, if used incorrectly, can be extremely dangerous. However, if we abide and execute the correct firearm safety rules, gun handling rules, the risk of creating a dangerous situation for ourselves or for the people around us is extremely minimal, if not eliminated altogether. Okay, so let's go over the 3 major parts of any firearm that everyone must know in order to handle a firearm safely. We're going to talk about the muzzle, the action, and the trigger. Let's talk a little bit more about our muzzle. So as we went over earlier, whichever direction our muzzle is pointed in is the same direction that our projectile will travel in. We need to imagine that when the projectile leaves our barrel, that it will go in a straight line into infinity and hit whatever is in front of it. Factually speaking, there's no firearm that can shoot into infinity. The projectile will always drop off at a certain distance. However, we don't really want to think of our firearms like that. We want to treat our muzzle, or our muzzle control, as if whatever is in front of it is something that could potentially be hit by the projectile. In our riflery, we need to be conscious of the direction our muzzle is pointed. We call that muzzle control. Whenever we are handling the firearm, we need to make sure that our muzzle is pointed in a safe direction. For us, there are 2 safe directions that we can have our firearm pointed. First direction is up towards the sky, because there's never going to be an instance where someone is walking above our heads. The second safe direction that we can have it pointed in is downrange towards the targets we're going to be shooting at, if the range officer has given us permission to do so. You'll notice that the way I'm holding the firearm right now, I'm controlling my muzzle by pointing it up towards the sky. And I'm holding the muzzle so it's about an inch over the top of my head. I don't want to hold it lower than my head, because if I look down, I could accidentally put my head in front of the muzzle. So whenever we are handling our firearms, like when we are walking, or if we are handing our rifle to another person like this, or receiving a rifle, the first thing that we're going to do is to control our muzzle. And that means having it pointed up in a safe direction. Right now I'm going to show you an example of bad muzzle control. So if we imagine that I'm walking like this and you're in front of me and I turn and I do that, this is bad muzzle control because I was not conscious of the direction that my muzzle is pointed in, and I also pointed it at another human being. So something that you may be wondering is why we do not hold our rifles like this. If you watch a lot of movies or video games, you may see the characters controlling their muzzles by pointing them at the ground. There are some situations where this may be appropriate. However, in air riflery, we never hold our rifles like this. There's a couple reasons for that. One is that with the type of actions our guns use, gravity will cause them to shut by themselves. And as we know, if the action shuts, our rifles have the potential to be fired. The second reason is that if our rifles were for some reason loaded and accidentally fired at the ground, if we were standing on a hard surface like a tile floor, that pellet would then leave our barrel, hit the tile floor, and then ricochet in an unknown direction. And we may accidentally hit someone or something that we do not want to get hit. So that is why we carry our rifles with the muzzles pointed up. So to wrap up muzzle control, I never want to ever point my muzzle at another human being. I always want to have it pointed in a safe direction. That safe direction is either up towards the sky or downrange at the targets if we are given permission to do that. If my rifle is inside of a gun case, then I can carry the gun case as it's intended to be carried. Now we're going to move on and talk about our actions. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about our action. So after we receive our firearm, the second thing that we're going to do is to visually inspect our action to make sure that it is in the open position. Whenever our action is in the open position, our firearm cannot be fired. The only times that I can close my action is when I am on the firing line and I am dry firing, or I am doing a shooting exercise where I am live firing. Whenever my rifle is grounded, or whenever I am handling the rifle, like walking with it, I want to have my action open. So I'm going to show you an example of a closed action and an open action. If you can see right here, there's a slot in the breech and I can see into the back of my barrel. This is called an open action. We know that the action is open because the bolt is locked to the rear, and we can see this slot. If I were to push the bolt all the way forward like that, and when I look at the breech, I can see that the bolt is now sealing my chamber. This is what we call a closed action. And when my action looks like this, that means that my rifle is ready to be fired. In order to open the action, I need to pull my bolt all the way to the rear. In our riflery, we use something called a CBI. All it is a orange weed whacker cord, but it serves a couple of very important functions. So as implied by the name, clear barrel indicator, it makes sure that our barrel is clear. So let me show you how it works. When my action is open, I'm going to locate the hole in the back of my barrel. I'm going to run the CBI through my barrel until I see it pop out the top of my muzzle. And now I know that there's no pellet inside my barrel. If there was a pellet inside my barrel, I would not be able to push the CBI all the way through. Another function of our CBI is to lock our actions in the open position. So you can see in order to close my action, the bolt has to move all the way in until it is partially inside the chamber. Because the CBI is sticking out the end of the chamber, I cannot close my action. If I tried to force it shut, I'd break the bolt. So just to reiterate, the second thing I'm going to do after I make sure that my muzzle is pointed in a safe direction is to visually inspect my chamber to make sure that it is open. In air riflery, I also want to be sure that I have a CBI inside of my barrel, locking the action open and making sure that the barrel is cleared. Now we're going to move on to talk about the trigger. Alright, so the last major part of the firearm that we need to know when we're talking about the three basic rules for safe gun handling is our trigger. So on this rifle, our trigger has a couple different parts. We have this flat piece of metal called a trigger guard, this short blade called a trigger safety, and a long blade, which is our primary trigger blade. Basically what a trigger does is that when we're aiming and we're preparing to fire, our trigger is what allows us to fire the rifle and release our shot. When we're talking about safe gun handling, we always want to have our trigger finger away from the trigger when we do not intend to shoot. So that means that if I'm walking with the rifle or handing it to someone, I never want to walk with the rifle where my finger is resting directly on this trigger blade. Because if I slip, I could accidentally fire the rifle and create a dangerous situation. When we take a look at this trigger, we have a trigger guard. What the trigger guard does is that when we're walking, if we were to accidentally slip, it guards our primary trigger blade from being accidentally pressed. This rifle has something called a trigger safety. What a trigger safety does is that it locks our primary trigger blade in place and it prevents it from being pulled to the rear to release our shot. A trigger safety is something that is nice to have, but it is not necessary for us in order to practice safe gun handling. Some rifles will have a trigger safety, some may not. And something that we need to remember is that, like any other mechanical device, a trigger safety could fail. So, using that logic, we don't want to only rely on a trigger safety for us to be safe. For us, our primary trigger safety is our trigger finger. As long as that trigger finger is not touching the trigger blade, our rifle should not be able to be fired. Really, the only appropriate time for me to have my finger on the trigger is when I am on the firing line and I am either dry firing or live firing. And even at that, I don't always want to have my trigger finger just resting on the primary trigger blade all the time. The only time that I want my finger to be on this blade is when I am aiming. After I have the bullseye in the middle of my sights, then I can move my trigger finger down onto the trigger blade. Before I do that, I will usually have it resting on the side of the stock like this. The reason I do this is because when I am bringing the rifle into position and my finger slips, if it's on the side of the stock, it's not going to hit the trigger blade. However, if it were resting on the trigger blade and I slip for some reason, then doing this motion may cause me to accidentally fire the rifle, and I would hit something that I do not intend to hit. So that just about wraps up the 3 major parts of a firearm that we need to know in order to be safe with it. So to reiterate, this is our muzzle. Whenever we are handling a firearm, we need to be sure that our muzzle is pointed in a safe direction. In air riflery, that means that it is either pointed up towards the sky or downrange towards the targets if we have been given permission to do so. We have our action. In air riflery, we need to be sure that whenever we are not doing a firing exercise, that our actions are held in the open position, usually with the CBIs inserted. Finally, we need to make sure that our finger is off of the trigger whenever we do not intend to fire the rifle or the firearm. Now we're going to move on to talk about some of the different parts that you may find on an air rifle. Alright, so we're just about done with this video, but I wanted to go over some basic rifle nomenclature other than muzzle, action, and trigger. So if we look at this this rifle, we can see that it has quite a few parts. Let's start off by talking about the stock. The stock on this rifle is this entire gray piece of plastic. It runs from the midsection of the barrel all the way to the back, to the butt. The stock is used to hold a whole bunch of parts of our rifle together, including our barreled action. On the front of the stock, we have the forestock. This is typically where our support hand goes when we are aiming the rifle. On our competition air rifles, a lot of times we'll have a T-slot accessory rail for us to put our hand stops or bipods. Moving back a little, we have the grip. Sometimes we call it a pistol grip, and it does what the name implies. It is an area for our hand to grip the stock. Moving back a little, we have this. This is called a comb or cheek piece. We call it a cheek piece because whenever we are aiming our rifle, our cheek contacts the cheek piece, and it actually helps us to stabilize the rifle when we are aiming. Moving on to the back, we have the butt. The butt of the stock sits in the pocket in our shoulder, and it allows us to pull the stock into our body like this. This particular butt has an adjustable butt plate that can be moved up or down to make the rifle better fit our bodies. Sitting inside of the stock is what we call our barreled action. Of course, like what we went over earlier, this is our action. Underneath it is our trigger. But there's quite a few things that are attached to it. To start off, let's talk about the barrel. Our barrel runs from the front of our action all the way to the end of our muzzle. Basically what the barrel is a tube that has rifling cut into it. Rifling is lands and grooves that are cut in a spiral pattern And basically what that does is it allows our projectile to spin as it is exiting the barrel. This makes our projectile more aerodynamic and more accurate. Every barrel is made to fire a specific size projectile. We call this the caliber. At the very back end of the barrel we have the breech. This is where we load the pellet. And when we close the bolt, that pushes the pellet into the chamber, which is slightly above the breech. On air rifles, like this one, we have something called an air tube or an air cylinder. The air tube is this larger diameter tube that runs parallel to the barrel. And if we look back here, we can see the pressure gauge. This tells us how much air is in our air tube. Before we start shooting, we need to fill up our air tube all the way, and the more shots that we fire, the more air is expelled from the tube. So after we take so many shots, we will have to refill the air inside of our air tube. Finally, on the top of the rifle, mounted to the receiver and muzzle, we have our sights. Basically what we use sights for is to aim the rifle. It helps us to aim the rifle accurately. On this particular rifle, we have what are called metallic sights. Specifically, these are Olympic globe style sights. Other firearms may use a high-powered magnified scope, or some firearms will use an electronic red dot optic. All of them serve the same purpose, which is to help the user aim the firearm. That about wraps up our video on safe gun handling. We learned about the three major parts of a firearm everyone should know in order to handle one safely, those being the muzzle, action, and trigger. And we learned about the three rules that correspond to those parts. 1, keeping our muzzles pointed in a safe direction. 2, keeping our actions open whenever we are handling a firearm behind the firing line or when we are not shooting it. And 3, keeping our fingers off of the trigger whenever we do not intend to shoot the firearm. We also went over some basic rifle nomenclature and learned about different parts of the air rifle. If there is one thing that I would like you to take away from this video, it is that these rules for basic gun handling are universal. Not only do they apply to air rifles, but they apply to any firearm that you may encounter in your life. Whether it's an AR-15, a shotgun, a hunting rifle, a handgun, or even an alternative firearm like a BB gun or an airsoft gun, a paintball gun, any of those. Even if you are someone who doesn't really like firearms, I think that it is still worth your time to learn the basic gun handling skills and how to be safe with a firearm should you ever encounter one in your life. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you were able to learn something from it, and please stay tuned for the second part to this video where we talk about the different parts of a shooting range.